I started keeping a journal the year I turned 50, which tells you something about the state I was in when Marin Voss found me at her door. Men who have lived by moving don't write things down. They don't need to. There's nothing behind them worth remembering, and nothing ahead of them worth planning for. I'd been that kind of man for the better part of 30 years when January of 1879 put me on a Dakota porch with frostbite in my left boot, and not enough sense to know I was about to lose those toes. I'll start there, that door, because everything I am now began with it. I'd been riding contract work out of Mandan, a cattle transfer for a beef outfit called Prentice and Sons that had dissolved before the final payment cleared. 2 months of wages gone. I wasn't the only hand cheated, but I was the only one fool enough to ride west in January instead of south. The storm that caught me on the open flats between Mandan and a settlement called Grover's Crossing was the kind of Dakota storm that doesn't announce itself. 1 hour the sky was pale and still. The next it was a white wall moving at a gallop, and I was riding into it. My horse, a gray gelding I called Ledger on account of his dark legs and white back, had more sense than I did. He turned his haunches to the wind and walked. I let him. A man argues with a horse in a blizzard. He loses both the argument and his ears. We walked for what I reckoned was 2 hours before Ledger stopped and refused to move again. I couldn't see 20 feet in any direction. The snow was horizontal, stinging my face above the scarf, and my left boot had gone from cold to numb to something past numb, that particular absence of feeling that a man who's wintered on the frontier knows to be afraid of. I dismounted and led Ledger by the reins, more to keep myself moving than to guide him. He was guiding me. He found the fence line. I almost didn't see it until the post was against my shoulder. I followed it, didn't know which direction, until a shape appeared in the white. A low homestead cabin, a barn attached by a roofed run, smoke coming from the chimney at a flat angle in the wind. I knocked. The door opened fast, the way a door opens when someone has been watching from the window and made their decision before you finish knocking. She was perhaps 35. Brown hair pulled back plain, a gray dress, a canvas apron with flour on it, and eyes the color of Winter Creek water, pale gray with something moving underneath. She looked at me the way a woman alone looks at a stranger in a blizzard. Not with fear exactly, but with the kind of clear-eyed assessment that fear has already run through and come out the other side of. "Get in," she said. "Bring your horse around to the barn door and I'll unlatch it from inside." That was Marin Voss. 4 words to size up a half-frozen stranger, 1 instruction, and she was already moving to the barn. I don't know what I expected. Charity has a taste to it sometimes, a thin sweetness, like something given with one eye on how it looks. What Marin gave me that night had no taste like that. She settled Ledger with hay and a blanket over his back as if she'd been doing it her whole life, which I later learned she had. She pulled my left boot off in the barn with her hands, felt the toes through the wool sock and said, "You'll keep them. Come inside." In the cabin she put a pan of cold water by the fire and made me soak the foot, not hot water, she was careful about that, while she went back to whatever she'd been doing before I knocked on her life, baking. There was a loaf on the board, finished and cooling, and she was working a second piece of dough. She didn't talk much. She asked my name, asked where I'd been headed. When I told her Grover's Crossing, she said the settlement was 12 miles east, and that the storm would blow itself out by morning. "You can sleep by the fire," she said. "I'll leave you blankets. I don't want to trouble you." She looked at me over her shoulder without slowing her hands on the dough. "You knocked. That means you needed to. There's no trouble in need." I didn't have an answer for that. I wasn't used to plainness without an edge to it. She fed me the loaf that was cooling, set it on the board with a crock of last summer's preserves and a wedge of hard cheese, and then she ate her own supper at the other end of the table, a bowl of something thin that I later understood was the last of the winter broth, extended. The loaf she gave me was the last one. I didn't know that then. I found out later, from a neighbor woman named Delphine Orr who lived 4 miles south and who told me, months after, that Marin had ridden to her the following week to borrow flour to see herself through to the March supply wagon. She gave a stranger her last loaf in January and then rode 4 miles in the cold to borrow flour, and she never said a word about it to me. Not that night. Not ever. I slept by her fire, and in the morning the storm was done and she had coffee on and cornmeal mush with a little salt, and she fed me that too before she handed my boot back. She dried it by the coals and told me Grover's Crossing was east by northeast. Follow the fence lines. Thank you, I said at the door. It felt small, it was small. She nodded. Ride safe, Mr. Harrow. I wrote out owing her something I didn't have a name for yet. I've spent 14 years now trying to say it right. I'm still not sure I've got it. Grover's Crossing had a freighting office and a saloon and not much else. I picked up a riding job with a rancher named Pickett who ran cattle east of town, and I wintered out the rest of January and all of February in Pickett's bunkhouse with 6 other hands and a cook stove that smelled of coal smoke and wet wool. I did my work. I got paid. I kept moving in the spring. That was my habit my whole life. Keep moving, don't put down roots, because roots are what get pulled up when the ground goes bad. But I thought about that door, that pan of cold water, that loaf on the board. I thought about the way she'd said, there's no trouble in need, flat and certain, like a woman who'd worked it out for herself and wasn't interested in debate. I thought about her eyes. Not in the way a man romanticizes a thing, more the way you turn a stone over in your hand because the weight of it surprises you. I worked 2 contracts that summer, one in Montana Territory moving horses and one back in Dakota driving fence posts for a homestead outfit. I saved what I made. That was new for me. Saving money requires a destination, and I'd never had one. Now I was saving without knowing entirely why, just knowing that I had unfinished business somewhere east of Mandan. The following autumn I rode back to Grover's Crossing and asked at the freighting office whether anyone knew of a widow woman named Voss running a homestead west of town. The clerk, a narrow man named Foss with ink on his fingers, looked up at me. Marin Voss, sure, out on Voss Flat 8 miles west, bought the place with her late husband 3 years back. He died the second winter. He paused. She's still out there alone. I believe so, I said. Tough country to work alone. He said it without opinion, just a fact, the way men in hard country note facts. Bank's been patient with her, but I hear she's 2 payments behind on the note. I thanked him and rode west. I found the place in October, the sky the color of pewter and the cottonwoods along the creek already bare. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, maybe because I remembered it with smoke and warmth and the storm raging behind me. And now, it just sat on the flat with the wind pulling at the roof shingles and a fence rail down along the south pasture. Ledger remembered it. He walked right to the hitching post and stopped. Marin came to the door with a rifle. She carried it level and easy, not threatening but not careless either. She looked at me for a long moment. I'd grown a beard over the winter and I wasn't sure she'd know me. Mr. Harrow, she said. She knew me. She set the rifle inside the door and stepped out onto the porch, arms folded against the cold. I wasn't expecting you. No, ma'am, I said. I wasn't entirely expecting myself. I stepped down from Ledger. I came to pay a debt. She looked at me with those creekwater eyes. You don't owe me anything. I know you believe that, I don't. A silence. Wind moved through the cottonwoods behind the barn. I talked to Foss at the freighting office, I said. He mentioned you were behind on the bank note. Her chin came up. That's my business, Mr. Harrow. Yes, ma'am. I'm not here to discuss your business. I'm here to ask if you'd let me work it off. I held her gaze. I've got wages saved. I'm a fair hand with fence and I'm a better hand with cattle. I'm not asking for room and board, just permission to be useful. Permission, she repeated, like she was tasting the word. "Yes, ma'am." Another silence. A hen went across the yard with the purposeful idiocy that hens have. "The south fence is down," she said finally. "I saw it coming in. If you fix the south fence, I'll consider it." "All right. And you'll sleep in the barn, not a question." "That suits me." She went back inside, and I went and got my tools from the saddlebag. The south fence took me 2 days. There was rot in 3 of the posts, and I had to dig them and set new ones, and the ground was already beginning to freeze below 6 inches, which makes post setting a conversation between a man and his stubbornness, that the man usually wins only because he's more pig-headed than the ground. Marin brought coffee out both afternoons without being asked, set it on the top rail of the fence, and went back to the house without comment. The second afternoon she brought a piece of cornbread with the coffee. I ate it standing up in the cold, and it was the best thing I'd tasted in months. When the fence was done, I came to the house and knocked, and she opened the door and looked at the fence line and then at me. "It's solid," she said. "It'll hold the winter. Supper's on." I ate at her table. She'd made a proper meal, salt pork and roasted turnips and bread, real bread with a good crust, and she'd set it for 2 without making a ceremony of it. We ate. She asked about the fence repair, and I told her about the rot and what I'd done about it. She asked about my work over the past year. I told her. She didn't offer much about herself, and I didn't ask. After supper, I helped carry the dishes to the wash basin, and she said, without turning from the work, "The banknote is $340, 2 payments missed." I dried my hands on my trousers. "I've got 400 saved." She was quiet for a long time, her hands in the soapy water. "I can't take your money, Mr. Harrow." "You gave me your last loaf of bread in a January blizzard," I said. "I've been thinking about it for 14 months. This isn't charity. This is a debt I owe." She turned around then and looked at me. Not the appraising look from the first night, something different. Like she was trying to decide if I understood what I was saying. "A loaf of bread isn't $340, she said. It was to me that night. She turned back to the dishes. I went to the barn, and in the morning I rode to Grover's Crossing and paid Marin Voss's banknote in full. I didn't tell her I'd done it. I came back with the receipt and left it on the table while she was out feeding the stock, and went back to fixing the barn's east wall where the boards had warped from last winter's ice. She found the receipt at noon when she came in for coffee. She came out to the barn with it in her hand. I heard her boots on the frozen ground, and I kept working. Cleet Harrow. She only used my first name when she was composing herself. I'd already learned that in 3 days. "Yes, ma'am." "You had no right to do this." I set down the hammer. "I had every right. I owed you." "You did not owe me $340. "I owed you more than that. I don't have more than that." I looked at her. "The receipt's in your name. The note's settled. It's your land, free and clear, same as it should have been." She stood with the receipt in both hands, and I watched something work its way across her face. Not crying. Marin didn't cry easy, but something behind the eyes, something that had been braced for a long time slowly letting go. "You can't stay here," she said. Her voice was level, but something underneath it wasn't. "It wouldn't be proper." "I know that." "Then why are you still here?" I picked up the hammer. "Because the east wall needs work. After that I'll go, if that's what you want." She stood there for another moment. Then she went back to the house. I stayed 3 more days finishing the east wall. She fed me supper each night. We talked more about her husband, Randolph Voss, who'd come out from Ohio with a surveyor's map and a plan that the Dakota winter had not consulted, about my year's drifting, about cattle and weather, and the way the grassland looked in June when everything was right and the whole territory seemed to be breathing. She had a way of listening that made a man want to talk, which was unusual for me. I'd been a quiet man my whole life, not from shyness but from having no one who seemed genuinely interested in what I said. Marin was interested. She'd tilt her head just slightly and her eyes would sharpen, and I'd find myself saying things I hadn't thought about in years. On the fourth day, I finished the wall, saddled Ledger, and came to the porch to say goodbye. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Haven't decided." She looked at Ledger, then at me. "The cattle need a second hand in the spring," she said. "I can't pay much, room in the barn and meals and a small wage." "I don't need much." "I know you don't." Her eyes found mine. "Come back in March. The ground'll be soft enough to work by then and I'll have the spring planting planned." "March," I said. "March," she said. I rode east and told myself it was just a job. A man lies to himself for convenience. I'd been doing it my whole life. This time I knew I was lying even while I was doing it, which was progress of a kind. I wintered in Grover's Crossing, doing odd work for the freighting outfit and sleeping in a room above the feed store that cost me 40 cents a week and smelled permanently of oats. I counted the months, then the weeks. I wasn't a man given to impatience. Patience was the one virtue the frontier had beat into me so thoroughly I could wait for almost anything. But February felt long in a way February hadn't felt to me since I was a boy waiting for spring. I rode back to Voss Flat on the 3rd of March, 1881. The snow was still on the ground but retreating, the creek running fast with melt, and the cottonwoods along the bank starting to show the faintest suggestion of leaf buds, just a green idea, not yet a fact. Ledger picked up his pace the last 2 miles. I didn't fight him. Marin was in the yard splitting kindling when I rode in. She straightened and looked at me with the same direct assessment as always, and then something relaxed in her face, so small I might have imagined it, except I'd been watching her face long enough to read what was underneath it. "March," she said. "3rd," I said. I said March, didn't specify. "No, ma'am, you didn't." She drove the hatchet into the splitting stump and left it there. "Coffee's on." Spring on the Dakota Flats is a kind of argument between the land and the sky that goes back and forth for 2 months before the land wins. There are days in March when the sun is warm enough to work in shirt sleeves, and then a night drops that freezes the meltwater solid again by morning, and you start over. I worked the cattle through all of it, checking fences again, the winter having found new places to break them, pulling 2 of Marin's 3 cows through a late cold snap that killed 2 of the neighbor Orr's calves, mending the barn roof where ice had heaved up the boards on the north pitch. Marin worked alongside me. That was something I hadn't quite anticipated. I thought, the way a man thinks without examining his assumptions, that she'd direct from the house and I'd do the outdoor work. But Marin Voss had been running that homestead alone for 2 years, and she knew every inch of it better than I did. She showed me where the ground ran wet in the spring thaw and what it did to the south pasture fence posts, the same rot I'd seen in October, recurring every season. She showed me where the cattle liked to drift in bad weather, and where they needed to be before a storm, and she was right every time and I was wrong twice before I started listening properly. She was not a soft woman. She was not a hard woman either. She was what the country made of a woman who refused to leave it, efficient, clear-eyed, without waste of motion or word, with a humor so dry you missed it if you weren't paying attention. I started paying attention. In April she told me about Randall. Not much. She wasn't a woman who poured herself out. But piece by piece, in the evenings after supper when we sat with coffee, and the light came long and gold through the west window, I got the shape of it. A good man, not strong enough for the country, taken by a lung fever the 2nd February. She'd buried him in the rise east of the house where he'd said the view reminded him of Ohio. She'd stayed because the land was bought and paid for, and leaving felt like saying his dying had been for nothing. "Does it still feel that way?" I asked her one evening. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, not quickly. "Less so," she said. "The land's more mine now than it was when he was alive. Is that a terrible thing to say?" "No," I said, "I think it's true." She looked at her coffee cup. "He wasn't a farmer." He thought he was, but he wasn't. I am. She said it without judgment, just fact. The land knew it. I didn't, not until after. I nodded. I understood about the land knowing things a person doesn't, not yet. In May she showed me the kitchen garden she'd planned. A bigger one than last year, she said, because now she had a second hand and could plant more than she could tend alone. She laid it out with string and stakes and her own careful system, onions and turnips and 2 kinds of squash, and a corner of sunflowers that she said weren't useful, but she planted them anyway because they were hers and she liked them. I dug the beds. It was the first time in 30 years I dug a kitchen garden. Something about it settled in me in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. The spring progressed. The cattle thrived. The calves came, 3 good ones from Marin's 3 cows, all healthy, the kind of spring result that in a hard country feels like an argument one. The garden went in. The fence lines held. The banknote was silent and paid, and I understood from the way Marin's shoulders sat different in April than they had in October that the weight of it had been on her in a way she'd never named, and now it wasn't. I was content in a way I'd never been. I kept telling myself it was the work. The work was honest and clear, and the results of it were visible every day. A fixed fence, a healthy calf, a row of onion sets in the dark earth. A man who has drifted his whole life doesn't know until he stops what it was he was missing. What he was missing was this. The specific this of a piece of land that needed him, and a woman who showed him how to see it right. But I didn't say any of that. A debt paid is one thing. What I wanted to ask Marin Voss was a different kind of asking, and I wasn't sure I had the right to it. The question came to me clearly in June. The way things do when you've been carrying them so long they just surface one morning without warning, already decided. I was at the east fence at first light, checking the wire from the winter's last pull, when I heard her come out of the house to start the morning chores. I watched her cross the yard, the direct way she walked, like everything she did, no wasted motion, and I thought about the 14 months I'd spent on the road thinking about her door, about coming back. About the way she said March and meant it. I didn't ask that day. I thought it through for 2 more weeks, not from uncertainty, I was certain, but from wanting to say it right. I'd been careless with words my whole life because I had no one to be careful for. I chose a Sunday evening in late June after supper, when the light was long and the day's work was done, and we were on the porch with the last of the coffee. The sunflowers in the kitchen garden were coming up, not blooming yet, just stalks, but tall and straight, and pointed at the sky the way sunflowers do, as if they know exactly what they're looking for. Marin, I said. I've been thinking about something. She looked at me sideways. You think like you work, she said. Slow and thorough. That's fair. I set my cup on the rail. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you can say no, and I'll respect it, and I won't leave over it. I'll still come back next March if you'll have me as a hand. She was quiet. The sunflower stalks moved in the evening breeze. I'd like to stay, I said. Not as your hired hand. As your husband, if you'd have me. I know I'm not what a man's supposed to offer a woman. I don't have land of my own. I don't have much of anything except wages saved and 30 years of knowing how to work, and the certainty that I've never wanted to be anywhere as much as I want to be here. I looked at the sunflowers because it was easier than looking at her. I know I owe you a debt I can't repay. I'm not asking because of that. I'm asking because, since January of 1879, I have not found a single thing that made me want to stop moving, and you did. Silence, a long one, long enough that I turned and looked at her because I needed to see her face. She was looking at the sunflower stalks with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, not the appraising look, not the composed look, not the dry amused look. Something quieter, something that had decided. You fixed my south fence, she said. Yes, ma'am. And the east wall. Yes. And you paid the banknote. I did. And you came back in March. 3rd of March. She looked at me. "You're not what I expected when I opened that door," she said. "No, ma'am, I don't suppose I am. I'm not easy to live with. I have my ways, and I don't bend them much. I've noticed I don't mind. I'll do my own thinking and my own deciding. I wouldn't want it otherwise." She picked up her coffee cup and looked into it and then set it down. "All right," she said. Just that, all right. In the quiet, certain way she said everything. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. "All right," I said. We sat on that porch for another hour while the light went out of the sky and the first stars came up over the flat, and we didn't say much more because there wasn't much more that needed saying. I'd spent 30 years filling the quiet with movement, and the movement with distance, and the distance with more distance. Sitting still in the dark on a porch in Dakota with a woman who said, "all right," like she meant forever, that was enough. That was more than enough. We married in July, at the small church in Grover's Crossing, with Delphine Orr and her husband Pyatt as witnesses, and the Reverend Albright officiating in a coat that was too big for him but pressed. Marin wore a gray dress I hadn't seen before, not her work dress, something finer with buttons at the wrists, and she braided her hair and pinned it up, and she looked the way the land looks in June when everything is right, and the whole territory seems to be breathing. I held her hand the whole ceremony. She let me. Delphine cried. Pyatt shook my hand so hard I felt it for a week. Albright gave a short sermon about a man finding his way home. I don't know if he knew how accurate he was. We drove back to Voss Flat in Marin's wagon in the July heat, the horses easy and unhurried, the grass on either side of the track green and tall, the sunflowers in the kitchen garden visible from the road as we came up the lane, blooming now, all of them, turned toward the afternoon sun. Marin saw them and her face did the thing it does when she's pleased. Not a smile exactly, more a particular quality of stillness, like something settling into the right place. "They came up good," she said. "Yes, ma'am," I said, "they did." She looked at me with those creekwater eyes, pale gray, something always moving underneath. She'd looked at me that way since the first night, that clear-eyed assessment that fear had already been through and come out the other side of. Now there was something else in it too, something that had put down roots. I know what I owe her. I've always known. The loaf in January was one kind of debt. What I owe her now is of a different kind entirely, the kind you don't pay off, the kind that just keeps compounding the longer you're together. I owe her the south fence every October and the east wall every spring, and the cattle through every cold snap that tries to take them. I owe her coffee before she asks for it, and listening with my full attention the way she listened to me when no one else did, and staying put when the old pull toward the road comes, and it comes. It will always come because 30 years is a long habit. But it comes softer now. Every year it comes a little softer. The sunflowers bloomed into August and then September took them. Marin saved the seeds in a paper envelope and labeled it in her careful hand and put it in the kitchen drawer for next year. She does this with everything, tends it, saves what it gives, plans for the next season. That's what a farmer is. That's what she is. She taught me to be one too, or as near to one as a man my age can become. I'm 53 now as I write this. The journal is 3 volumes. Marin reads them sometimes, not all of it, but the parts I leave open on the table, which is my way of inviting her and her way of accepting without making a thing of it. She read the entry about the first night. She set the journal down and said, "You remembered it wrong." Did I? I wasn't nearly as composed as you wrote it. You seemed composed. I was terrified, she said. A strange man in a blizzard. I'd been alone for 2 years. You didn't show it. That's different from not feeling it. I thought about that for a while. Then you were braver than I wrote. She picked up the journal and handed it back to me. Write it right this time. So here it is, written right. She was terrified and opened the door anyway, because there's no trouble in need, and she decided that before she finished looking through the window. That's the woman who gave a stranger her last loaf of bread in January and then rode 4 miles in the cold to borrow flour without saying a word about it. That's the woman who said, "all right," in the particular, quiet way she says everything that she means forever. I rode onto this flat owing a debt I couldn't name. I live here now because she let me try to pay it. The debt still stands. I expect it always will. That's all right. Some debts are worth carrying. This one's the best thing I ever owed.